So Derek, here we go. This report that Richard has eloquently described to us talks about the dangers of having the wrong economic incentives in place. That's why we see water-intensive crops being grown in the wrong areas. What are your thoughts on how to change incentives? And what insights do you take from the report in this area?
So before we can talk about incentives, we have to have a grasp of what the true value of water and water systems are. And so that's a big part of what we do at Conservation International, including some work with the bank, which leads the global partnership on WAVES, which is really trying to account for all natural capital and its true value. And so the report provided some real insights into the value of protecting water sources, and also these important cumulative or cascading impacts. So all of the externalities, which if we can prevent those from happening within a watershed, we're better incorporating, I think, the true value of a healthy freshwater system. And so I think first we have to begin by valuing water resources properly. And that's not simply putting a price on water. As Richard pointed out, there are different points within the water delivery system where you need to have different types of incentives. And so beginning with protecting water sources, here we do have decades of experience now attempting to create these incentives or to realign incentives to get farmers, foresters to better protect the watersheds. But of course, the benefits are going downstream. And that's something that's important to keep in mind, that water is going to flow downhill. And so we have to be accounting for the fact that the people who have certain opportunity costs are not necessarily the ones who are benefiting. So we have to move incentives from downstream to upstream. And so there is experience on payments for environmental services or watershed services in attempting to do that, whether it's a municipal utility who's providing the incentives upstream. It may be one city negotiating with another on reallocating water rights. So there are experiments with this, but what we've really found is it's quite challenging. And so we have to understand the full value at a watershed scale, I would say, too, that this is not something that can be dictated at a national scale. We have to get down to the actual basins, the shared resources, and develop those incentives at that scale, because you have to be able to ultimately be negotiating with farmers and landholders from city to work out the appropriate incentives.
Thank you for that. Betsy. The report uncovers a new link between repeated years of below average rainfall and the pressure this puts on farmers to expand their cropland, sometimes into virgin forests. WRI does a great deal of work on forest monitoring. Can you tell us a little bit about how deforestation not only has global impacts with respect to carbon emissions, but also has local impacts on water supplies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I was fascinated by this finding from the report that rainfall variability could be responsible for up to 60% in the average rate of cropland expansion. It's a very intriguing finding, I think. First of all, let me just say, too, I really commend the bank, Global Water Practice, and Richard in particular and his team for both this report and the High and Dry report, continuing to shine a spotlight on this critical issue around water scarcity and water stress, and the broader macroeconomic, global economic and development questions and impacts, and the social impacts, which he's so nicely laid out in his talk, too. We need more and more of this, and we need others to be paying attention. So I'll come back off my soapbox and answer your question, Laura, sorry. WRI does do a lot of work in monitoring forest cover loss globally. Some of you might be familiar with the Global Forest Watch tool that WRI developed with researchers from University of Maryland and many, many others. We provide near real-time updates and analysis of where forest cover change is happening around the globe at a 30-meter resolution. We just launched a handheld smartphone application of this that can be used by local civil society organizations for sort of ground truthing that information, and also for providing on-the-ground updates. What we see is that historically there's been a 30% loss in forest cover. An additional 20% of the world's forests have been degraded. And we just did an analysis on forest cover loss for 2016. And this, by the way, includes not just deforestation, but loss of all trees. So those could include forest plantations and so on. So I just want to note that. But what we saw in 2016 was a 51% increase year on year in forest or tree cover loss globally. So 30 million hectares. This is obviously not a good trend. We're seeing a lot of loss to fires, to agriculture, as this report talks about, logging, mining, and many other pressures as we see global food chains changing and diets changing. Increases, for example, in the Amazon in deforestation for soy and for meat and livestock-based protein as well. And so that's sort of the background. But to come back to the question of what I think is often not well documented and talked about, and it's nice that it's talked about so much in this report, is the connection between forests and water. And forests, watersheds, and as Derek has just said, the ecosystem services provided by those watersheds. And not only by forests, but by also other naturally vegetated watersheds, wetlands, grasslands, and the like. And what we see are sort of three different impacts. And one of the challenges is that we still don't know enough about these impacts. The impacts on water quality of deforestation and forest cover loss are quite clear. In fact, there was just a new paper that came out in Nature Communications in the last month that looked at 35 different watersheds, and they found a statistically significant effect of upstream loss of forest cover on child diarrheal disease downstream for a variety of reasons. Both impacts of actual contaminants getting into the watershed and other things that we can go into in more detail in rural areas. So there's clearly that very direct kind of impact. Cities are well aware of those impacts when they lie downstream of areas that are rapidly changing in terms of their land use. A second area is flood attenuation, or sort of flow regulation. We're fairly clear about what the value of these natural vegetated areas is across watersheds, and wetlands and so on. Water yield is a tougher one. There's just also a recent paper that came out which was a summary of all of the research and data that's out there by Filoso et al. This is a woman who is part of this University of Maryland synthesis study, and she looked at all of the analysis out there, and the data sets would suggest that reforestation, so increases in forest cover, actually lead to less downstream blue water yield. So trees are taking up more water, they're transpiring it. What was interesting about this literature review and analysis is that it showed that there was a green water impact. So there was a shallow groundwater benefit and a benefit in wetted soils for agricultural production from areas that had had reforestation. And a classic example of this, and that gets at your question too, Laura, about what's the impact of forests, is in the north in Ethiopia, in Tigray. Many of you may be familiar with this iconic example, a completely denuded and barren landscape which had been gone through desertification because of removal of trees. And over the course of 25 or 30 years, by very painstaking efforts by individuals to go back in and reforest, so similar to the green wall that's been happening in the Sahel, there's been a wholesale change in agricultural productivity. People are now migrating into Tigray, not migrating out. And the really most interesting impact has been the increase in artesian wells downstream and the increase in shallow groundwater and a rising water table. And this has all been very well documented in studies and so on. So this is the kind of connection that we see, I think, and that we should be paying more attention to and doing more research with. That's sort of at a watershed scale. I just want to make one other point that I think we don't know how to quantify, but we, I think, are seeing the impacts of it in some of the slides that Richard showed in the very beginning. And that is the impacts at sort of continental scales of deforestation and forest cover loss. So many of you might be familiar with research that's been done over years. For example, Antonio Nobre in Brazil with the Brazilian Space Agency has looked at the impacts of Amazon deforestation on the loss of sort of downstream rivers of the sky, the so-called biotic pump of water that's moving from those trees into the atmosphere and providing rain downstream. That's a very unscientific description, but the scientific papers go into more analysis of this. Johan Rockström, who's done a lot of work on planetary boundaries, is also beginning to see in some of the research that they're doing these kinds of effects across many biomes in the world. And so I think this is a very important and potentially very frightening impact if we're not understanding it better. Those impacts from climate change and from deforestation and human activity on the global hydrologic cycle, or hydrologic cycles at least at a continental level. So those are the connections I would draw.
That's really amazing. Thank you very much. Moving on to Greg, let me ask you this. Water is one of the most crucial areas of sustainable development, yet it doesn't always receive the attention it deserves. What role can the private sector play in both raising awareness and stewarding water resources?
So first of all, thanks to the World Bank for having me here. I appreciate it. I could say over my 30-year career, professional career, the level of awareness around water, it's important to point out, has risen dramatically. I mean, even in the last 5 years, certainly the last 10 years, the amount of people that are talking about it, that recognize the challenges, that see the link to climate change from an adaptation standpoint, is completely transformed. I mean, you used to struggle to find a conference of meaning on water, and now you could attend one every week, and there's lots of people working on it. So, but that doesn't mean that you're going to Amsterdam, right? It doesn't mean that the level of awareness among the public is high enough. So let me separate, you've asked two questions, raising awareness and stewarding the resource. So in raising awareness, I'll separate that between business to business and business to government and the public. So even in the public, the awareness level around water issues has risen dramatically. Now, one of the top environmental, social challenges that people respond to in terms of polls behind more traditional and everlasting things like employment and incomes and things like that. So what is the role of the private sector in raising awareness from the public? I'm not sure we have a role. I'm not sure that we have the ability to raise that awareness. Now, let me explain why, because you're looking at me, and I'm from the Coca-Cola company, and we spend, I don't know, as a system, some $4 or $5 billion a year on marketing. And when you look at the reach that consumer brands in particular, whether they're Nike or Apple or Google or Coca-Cola, have in terms of reaching the general public, it's tremendous. But what you have to understand is that companies don't do marketing. Companies communicate. Brands do marketing, right? And the marketing budget is always going to be much, much higher than a communications budget, right? We may spend a few $100,000 communicating, and we'll spend millions or even billions from a marketing standpoint. So why don't you get a brand like Coca-Cola or Sprite or Fanta to raise awareness through their consumer marketing around water issues or some other issue? The problem is you've got to convince that brand to make that topic part of its brand identity. Every brand has a value, some higher than others, and that value is derived, of course, from the product, but how that brand is marketed, right? And so what the architecture, the visual identity of that brand is, what consumer segment that it's going after, that's all very carefully crafted. And to take an issue like water, which isn't simple, Richard, it is very complex because it's so multifaceted, and make that part of your brand identity is very difficult to convince someone to do that. So I think, you know, the potential exists, and we've made some early attempts at that, or some very recent attempts at that, but I'm not sure that the private sector is the one to raise awareness among the general public. but I stand ready to be corrected. Now, on business to business and business to government, absolutely. The role there is for businesses in their stewardship of the resource to engage their value chain. So their customers, their consumers, their upstream supply chain. We and a lot of our peers in the space certainly do that. You see a lot of companies, particularly the ones with large footprints in agriculture and livestock, pushing requirements down to their suppliers across environmental and social issues, water being chief among those. And then using our voice individually, but more powerfully collectively, to engage government. And there you see us work even pre-competitively. We are part of, here at the World Bank now, the 2030 Water Resources Group, which is public, private, civil society collectively and pre-competitively engaging governments at their invitation on water policy issues. And so raising awareness in that sense is very much the role of business. So that's raising awareness. From stewarding the resources, I think you have two approaches. So one is, you know, what I've always said is keep your house in order. What I could also rephrase as do no harm. And if I wanted to be more modern and use the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, businesses ask, well, what role does the private sector have in the SDGs? And everyone's sort of worried when they get that question on the private sector because they're worried, are you going to be asking us to pay for this? And I think that's private finance, of which there's a lot of cash out there, but you just don't have credit-worthy infrastructure or utilities or municipalities for them to make that type of investment. But if you take that SDG approach, I've had someone ask me recently, so what do I do to align my water practices with the SDGs? I said, do no harm. Take each one of the SDG 6, for instance, around water, and are you being efficient? Are you providing safe water access and sanitation to all your employees in the workplace? Are you treating your wastewater? Are you sustainably sourcing your water? So you can use the SDG 6 as sort of a framework for how you're not adding to the problem that the SDG is trying to solve. So that's one approach. And then a more proactive approach, and that's where you see a lot of companies through the leadership of the CE Water Mandate, Alliance for Water Stewardship, WRI's Aqueduct Water Risk Management, where people are assessing their risks qualitatively, better to do it quantitatively, and then that risk assessment forming the business case to lead to an explosion, I would say, of business, and you would agree, that are now stepped outside of the four walls of their plant where they focus on efficiency and stormwater and wastewater and water reuse into those shared watersheds, communities, and of course, ultimately the policy environment.
Thank you for that. Marianne, how does the analytical work like this help shape the understanding of issues? And what do you see as the contribution of this work in combating poverty? And would you have examples of analytical work which have influenced policy or direction? And what made that work successful?
So, first of all, I just really want to make a plug for those of you who haven't read the book, because, you know, as chief economist for a very large group that has a lot of engineers, a lot of economists, and maybe not so many writers, I have to insist on the fact and really alert you to the fact that this is beautifully written. It's got substance and style, and it's also remarkably succinct. I'm very fond of I'm not sure if it's a real quote, the famous Mark Twain thing, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. I think writing something succinct and so pithy is really an art form, and so really hats off to the team for doing that. And really, I think you can read it very quickly and really learn a lot, and it's just so readable. It's a great pleasure. So in terms of how it helps us shape our understanding of the issues, I think it does three things very well. One is it enables us to step back, and you know, it reminds me of the parable of the blind men and the elephant, which you probably all know. You know, a bunch of blind men approach an elephant, and the first one says, "Oh, it's a pillar," because he's touched one of the leg, and the other one, you know, touches the flank of the elephant and says, "Oh, it's a wall," and the other one says, "Oh, it's a spear," having touched the what do you call it? The trunk. What are they called? Tusk. Yeah. So, and the thing about water is that it's a bit like the elephant to the blind man, right? There are all these different communities that see one side of it. So you've got the water resource management people who say you've got to take this holistic approach and so on and so forth, and think upstream and think downstream. And then you've got the water and sanitation people who have a different angle. And then you've got the ag people and the irrigation specialists. And then you've got the disaster risk management specialists. And all of them see one side of it. And I think what's really wonderful about having this book on the economics of water really step back and enable us to work from a common understanding. And I think that's something we fail to do often, and so that's extremely helpful. Another thing that it does very well is to drill down on a number of topics. Some of them are somewhat known, but perhaps not to all the community, and I think where more was developed, and in particular this issue of the intergenerational transmission of poverty, the fact that droughts have an immediate impact on a person's lifetime, but that you see impacts over several generations. And there, I think it's very nicely pulled together. Some of the other thing was the new things. I think the link with deforestation, I think my understanding is that that's pretty new. I had never seen that kind of work. And the other one, which to me was perhaps the most striking, was the work on the impact of droughts on firm productivity and on urban productivity. I don't think any of us had any understanding that this was an important channel, and I think that's an important one. I'm not sure we fully figured out the policy implication of that, and I think it deserves some more work, which I'm sure Richard and the team and other colleagues will pursue. Also, I think the relative impact of droughts and flood. I mean, I think we've got an understanding of impacts of one, impact of the other, but not necessarily the fact that that misery in slow motion, as you so eloquently put it, really can have much greater impact. And then the third thing is the bully pulpit function. And I think it's the book is a very nice reminder of a couple of things that we know in the back of our mind but need a constant reminder. One is the fact that solutions to the impacts on the poor of water scarcity, of water variability, cannot just come from the water sector. That this is really something where we really have to be able to step back and work across the different sectors, and in particular, this issue of the social safety nets. And increasingly, I think we're finding, particularly when it comes to anything related to climate change, the increasing importance of having well-developed social safety nets. And I think, fortunately, what we're seeing is that whereas 10 years ago we thought that safety nets and were something only really middle-income countries could afford, we're now discovering this is really something even extremely poor countries can do and do well, and that can have a massive impact. Another thing where it's a great bully pulpit, I think, is demand-side management. This reminder that whatever we do, this paradox of supply. I mean, it's the same battle in the transport sector. If you build it, they will come. Yes, they do come. And they come and they ask for more. So the demand side management, I think, is a really, really critical one. In terms of the contribution that this type of work can have to the reduction of poverty, I think having a clear narrative and a good understanding of the channels of transmission. We can't begin to combat poverty when we don't necessarily understand all the different things. I think 10, 15 years ago, we had a pretty unidimensional vision of what caused poverty, and it was, maybe growth, purely growth. Now we're increasingly increasingly understanding that there's all these other factors that need to be addressed that are complementary to the growth. I think another thing that was very interesting is this, this better understanding of water as an input into the production function of the poor, be it in the agricultural, in the rural areas through agriculture, but also urban. I think one of the neat point that you make in the book is that it's the smallest firms that are most affected by water scarcity, and the smallest firms are the ones that have this very deep impact on poverty and employ sort of lower fringe of society afterwards. And then just a last couple of points. I think what's really important again is some of the policy recommendations that you make or you set up the stage for. I think the social safety nets, the need to help household manage idiosyncratic shocks. You have a very nice discussion. There's a very nice discussion on the errors of exclusion, of the fact that, an individual not having access to the water will harm not just this individual, but others in society and have this long-term impact. And then what's not discussed in here, but will be discussed in other work, and I think you really set up the stage for it, is the whole issue of subsidies, which, we had a very heated discussion, a long discussion of this morning, and the practice is really doing some very interesting work. And some really interesting ideas are emerging that I wasn't familiar with, that, we tend to focus our work on subsidies, on utilities. And yet there's so much more that we want to think about. And, we subsidize so much of the networked infrastructure, right? The sewers or whatever. And we perhaps need to rethink about, our capital subsidy bias maybe needs to be delivered, needs to be rethought and possibly targeted to non-network solutions that could really, if well managed and put together with good pricing schemes and demand-side management, could really make a difference. So let me end here. I went on much longer than I had said I would.
No, that's great. We'll start round two with Derek again. And I think this is a pretty simple but really complicated question for you. What do you see as critical to the success factors in addressing water stress?
How much time do we have left?
Well, we're gonna give you about 17 minutes.
Me,
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Okay. Well, the critical success factors. I would say to start, and I think the report does a very good job of this, of not oversimplifying this issue. Often when we talk about water, in order to make it more succinct or to catch someone's attention, we reduce it to scarcity. And of course, the book is much about scarcity and points out rightly that droughts have an outsized impact relative to floods, that there are so many cascading impacts of water scarcity, but water challenges go well beyond scarcity. And so I have a knee-jerk reaction to the term water stress because, first of all, I think the FAO would be the first to admit that their definition of water stress has probably outlived its utility at this point, that we have to really advance our thinking in terms of how we measure water and how we address the complex problems. So one approach that we've taken within Conservation International is to talk about freshwater health now. And of course, water stress is a component of that. Scarcity is likely to be the major issue in any water basin, but it's not the only issue. And often it's a matter of trade-offs also that are happening, that water scarcity can be induced because you have an upstream user that's taking out more than their perhaps fair share. So we have to be able to capture that sort of complexity and those trade-offs that are happening, within any particular region. So I would say we begin by not shying away from this complexity. And I think that demands more, as the report called for, analysis and research at the regional scale to also look at these issues such as deforestation and its climatological impacts. That's something that we miss if we focus immediately at the ground level. So we do need to be looking at some of these kind of mesoscale issues as well. But we also have to appreciate the fact that water governance doesn't get the attention it deserves. And it's starting to get more attention, even in how we can measure water governance. There's an initiative that the OECD is leading to really systematically assess how water governance systems are performing. And I'd make a distinction between governance and management. Often when we want to talk about policy issues or to talk about what needs to happen, we say, well, management ought to do this. In what basin is there actually a management entity that we can say has complete control over the water resources? That's been a pipe dream. The idea of integrated water resource management has been around for decades. It has generally failed to live up to its potential because of the complexity of governing these resources. You have siloed agencies. The forestry ministry and its agencies below it focus on forests. They know they have a connection to water, but they don't have control over the resources. You may have a powerful ministry of water resources. They tend to focus on quantity, not quality. That's handed off to an environmental agency, and so on. And so water governance requires this collaboration, cooperation among not just the sectoral agencies, but also different levels of government. In most basins, you'll have multiple administrative jurisdictions who want to claim some right to the water, who are economically competitive with one another, so don't have an incentive to cooperate on shared water resources. And so we can't simply make policy prescriptions without understanding the governance situation in a particular place. So it is complex. It doesn't mean it's intractable, but it requires much more attention to who actually dictate, what's the appropriate level for the policy? How much can we rely on river basin organizations or lake basin organizations? Does everything have to be dictated at a national level? And of course, many of the most important river basins and aquifers are transboundary as well. And so we can't rely on national policies. And I'm sorry if I'm just making it sound like this is hopeless, but I think we just have to dig into this sort of complexity.
Thank you. Okay, now we're moving into the speed round. I'm advised that we want to leave time for questions and answers. We have another question for each of the panel, but I want to ask you guys if there are a lot of questions out there, and we want to let you all get out of here at the right time. Give me a show of hands of where we are in questions from the audience. So let's take a round of questions, and then we can, if the questions wane, we'll come back.
Thank you, and thanks for an invitation to the panel. I'll keep it a really short question. I think it's a short question. We have this kind of fixed supply and this radically increasing demand, right? So, the cost per unit can only go up. So at what point does it break? At what point are the incentives so great that resources poured back into increasing supply? And the metaphor I'm thinking of is like the oil crisis, where we went from shortage to now surplus. Is there any kind of speculation on a forecast at what point there's such an incentive that we then begin putting resources into increasing supply instead of better and better redistribution of the same amount of water?
Who wants, Richard? Does anyone up here?
I'll withdraw the question if it takes too long, okay?
No.
I think I saw a couple of hands up back here.
Are you going to remember them all? Okay.
Great. Hi, everybody. John Oldfield with Global Water 2020. Thanks for a great session so far. Since we're so close to various stakeholders in Washington, D.C., I'm going to ask a D.C. question for you. We expect, per a law from 2 years ago, the first ever whole of U.S. government global water strategy to be publicly released any day now. It was due on October 1st, actually. So, a question for you all is, what more do you think stakeholders in the United States could do? State aid, USAID, maybe our intelligence community, DOD, to help get ahead of some of these water-related, I'll call them threats, security challenges, and I'd be interested in both an answer with respect to the public sector, but also the private sector. There's a lot of private sector actors in the United States looking at our remote sensing data, the petabytes of information that are coming in, trying to figure out, again, how to go upstream, literally and figuratively, on water threats. So let me just leave it at that and look for opportunities perhaps to expand the footprint of water in the relationship between the U.S. government and the World Bank writ large. Thank you.
And we had one more question over here.
Winston Jimenez with Watershare. And this question is for Betsy. When it comes to the province of Tigray in Ethiopia and reversal of, the expansion of the desert, you mentioned that it took about 30 years to get that going. But with all the conflict and all that that's going on, how is the focus maintained?
How do you guys want to?
So I won't answer all of the questions, but I will take the first one for sure. So yes, you're absolutely right. So we've got rising demand, we've got fixed supply. But what do we have that's missing, which is not like oil? It's a market. And so when we have this deficit, it's often filled by informal markets, things like water tankers, and we're trying to understand those a lot better. So I don't think it's a classic market failure. I don't think there's an assurance that just because we've got these rising water deficits, that we're going to try to fix that by fixing the sources of supply, not least because a lot of those sources of supply are public goods. They don't lend themselves to a private sector investment and intervention. So I could see the problem worsening and costs rising, rather than necessarily seeing solutions as you have for oil.
I'll ask a follow-up afterwards. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
And I want to make sure, I think part of your question was where do we start to hit an inflection point where the incentives become strong enough to start increasing freshwater supply, whether through desal or other. Right. I mean, for example, there are many stores of deep groundwater which are not economically feasible right now to extract and incredibly energy intensive. That's why they're expensive, but there are, of course, other costs, externalities with that. I just want to say on that, some analysis that WRI has done under its aqueduct tool, looking at future projections using IPCC data to look at future scenarios of demand and supply. So thinking about general circulation models and what might be changes in supply and in hydrologic conditions, and then also looking at future trajectories for demand. The takeaway message from that, if you project forward to 2040 using that data, is that it's demand that's the driver. There's no question that certain regions are already experiencing big changes in interannual variability, deeper droughts, just as Richard was pointing to. But I guess the sort of good news story, if we want to try to think about it as good news from what Derek was saying, is that we could do things to solve that problem. And so there's plenty that can be done even still on demand management, a tremendous amount that's not being done. So I just wanted to say that. John's, your question about the U.S. government strategy, I think, is a really interesting one. I think there's something like 22 separate government agencies within the U.S. government that have something to do with water. There is, of course, no Department of Water, which at least exists in some countries, though it's often very siloed and never has the power that finance or agriculture or energy has. I think there are a whole set of things that need to be done, starting with getting our own house in order internally. And I kind of want to come back to something that was said before, and I promise not to go on and on here, but what I like about this report as well is that you point to there are low regret strategies and policies that we know well enough to be actually implementing now. We're not doing them in most places. From California to Massachusetts to Ethiopia to, you name it. And why is that? There's no accountability for not doing it, is one thing. There is this, I think, this belief set that if we start to run out of water, we'll just get it from somewhere else. Some interbasin transfer, we'll pump it from deeper from underground or something like that. We'll engineer our way out of the crisis. And I think that's absolutely a fallacy, and I think there's just been no penalty, honestly, for doing something different. What's, I think, interesting in the private sector is that investors are starting to say, wait a minute, what kind of water risks are you facing? Companies are more and more being required or expected to be able to actually make the case for how they can continue to operate well in certain places. Governments, for the most part, their feet have not been held to the fire in the same way, and that, I think, really needs to change. And then on the Tigray question, my understanding, and I'm not an expert in Ethiopia, there are probably people in this room that know far more about it than I do. Chris Ray, who is a senior fellow with WRI, has worked there for decades and decades, and he actually helped to produce a wonderful film, the name of which just went out of my head, but there is a film about this, which I'll it'll come to mind. Basically, it was a local community decision to sort of take their fate into their hands. And it's a very tight-knit community. The current government right now is Tigrayan. It's actually it's a minority community within the country. And so there was, I think, culturally the basis for maintaining that focus. It was also part of the movement against the Derg, the Marxist regime that was in power. Of course, many of us remember the famines in the 1980s. And so it had that sort of fervor behind it, too. It was an insurgency movement as well. But it was, again, very successful. The government has taken on board some of the policies behind that, and that is in the last drought, not this current year, but last year, actually paying people to do work to create small stone bunds and ways of infiltrating water when it does rain into groundwater and providing food for work for communities. So some of those ideas have sort of been brought on board at a government policy level, too.
Just do
Greg?
quick rapid fire on three things. So first of all, John, to your point on U.S. foreign policy, David Reed with WWF just published a book. It's Water Security and U.S. Diplomacy. I think it's great. He looks at it from a military or an intelligence standpoint, from a state or diplomatic standpoint, and then from an aid standpoint. And I think the biggest opportunity we have, and we see it every day because we have Coca-Cola has a partnership with USAID on water and development, is they're really hamstrung by Congress in terms of having to fund things that have deliverables that you can measure. So safe water access, sanitation, and they're leaving out what is arguably even more important, and that's around capability building. It's about policy engagement. You see the European agencies doing that, aid, overseas development assistance doing that, but U.S. could do a lot more there. I disagree that demand management is the key to your question about a breaking point. I mean, if you're growing cotton in the desert, doing it more efficiently, reducing the demand is not the answer. So I think there's a lot of places that need to focus on supply now, if only for climate change adaptation. When you think of ice and snow changing to rain, think California, they need to work on storage, whether that's underground or above ground, and it has very little to do with demand, which is really, outside of the agricultural sector, is very low. You know, U.S. municipal and residential and even industrial water demand has gone down over the last 50 years, not up. Pacific Institute. But I do believe the answer lies in valuation, right? You know, why are we partnered with the World Bank? It's not because the World Bank Group, because they have money. That's not what we're there for. We're there because they're economists. They think about it in terms of the economy. And so I have seen the taking from the private sector a valuation standpoint, taking an economic lens to water, whether you do hydroeconomic analysis of a country's economy and its growth plans, which is the original premise of 2030 WRG, whether you engage in water funds, whether investors demand that you quantify in financial terms your risk to water to form a business case to act, or more powerfully, when you change the dialogue on water infrastructure, particularly municipal water and sanitation, from substance to service, it becomes very much an economic discussion, and you have a much higher likelihood of moving the needle from this is a human right and you need to subsidize it in an extreme fashion to how do we actually pay for this? You can't sit around and have a discussion about rights and expect to get to somebody actually turning on the tap at 3 a.m. And I challenge the notion of a monopoly. There are other services that you pay for, but you buy a substance where it appears to be like water, where you have a monopoly, but yet it's been demonopolized. For instance, where I live in Atlanta, there's one entity that provides natural gases to houses, but you can buy that service from up to 7 different companies. So you can demonopolize what seems to be a natural monopoly. The point is, not to get into the details of it, but to focus on economic terms, valuation. That's certainly what brings the private sector to the table, and I think is a big part of what can help address a lot of the problems in water, not all of them.
Thank you.
So, if I may, you really just made my day here in saying that what you value at the World Bank is not its money, but its economists. I'm going to quote you over and over. My year, you've made my year here. It's fabulous. But as a nitpicking economist, let me react to a couple of things. So first of all, just when we talk about demand-side management, I think not growing cotton in the desert is the biggest part of the demand-side management, and that's exactly where we want to go. And that's where it gets a little complicated when, cotton in the desert is one thing, but another is, say, in the Middle East, the desire of most Middle Eastern countries to remain food independent. Partly because during the last food crisis ships would come into the harbor of Tunis and turn around, ships with grains on them and turn around just from in front of because they're small market, they don't have that ability to enforce their contracts. So it's very difficult for them when we tell them, look, you're basically exporting water, virtual water. You should get out of, growing your crops and you should import them. It's very hard for us to be able to guarantee them that they would get the food security. So working on these aspects is a big part of the demand-side management. So I think demand-side management is, of course, at the level of the individual consumer, etc. But it's also about your agricultural strategy, given that what is agriculture? Agriculture is 70% of water consumption. So of course it's there. And then just one small thing that I think there's a lot of work in the context of climate change that's being done on the links between water shocks and large population movements and migration. The World Bank is just finishing a big report on migration. And, in the case of Syria, for example, there's, apparent evidence that a lot of the problems that are happening today are due to massive migration into urban areas that are a result of a tremendous drought that lasted for a number of years. So I think trying to understand a bit better all of these things is certainly a big part of the overall, you're talking about diplomacy, but it's also a big part of our overall development policies and development challenges, understanding what these channels are. And again, as I was saying earlier, we used to have a very narrow understanding of the roots of poverty. I think we're also now beginning to have a broader understanding of the roots of political stability, and water is certainly an essential element in that.
First, I would just like Marianne, I also want to thank Greg for making the point that you value the knowledge that we share. And I think this particular report is an example of those kind of knowledge that the World Bank, and particularly in this case, the Water Global Practice, that want to take the lead and share that kind of analytics with our clients to influence the operation, influence the policy dialogue. We're not an academic institution. We don't do research for the sake of research. I keep saying to my teams, we want to use this kind of work to influence the dialogue that we have. So I'm glad that you see this as a very valuable work that we do. And like I said, we can afford to do too many of these, so we hope that every year we have one or two plays, this kind of a flagship report that we can really influence the dialogues. And second point is, I think the presentation has argued very well that water is interconnected and its impact on the economy is multifaceted. And to tackle the challenge, we really need to work together, across different sectors and cross silos. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We have to look at the context. There's a lot of, interesting discussion during the panel talking about water governance. In fact, we're actually doing that in a number of countries that we're working. I think, Greg, you also mentioned the point about valuing water in your last comment. It's actually one of the big initiatives that we're pushing for as part of the high-level panel on water, because we all agree until we put a value on water, all this demand management is going to be a very difficult challenge. Again, so I'm not going to repeat, all the key points have been discussed, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank on the audience for your participation and for your coming for this event, and we look forward to other opportunities.